It was the kind of winter that seemed to bite through bone. The year was 1902, and Wisconsin lay silent under a crust of snow that glittered like broken glass. From a distance, the Darrow estate stood like a wound on the white landscape. Its black wood panels already aged from decades of bitter cold. Its windows glowing with the faint light of kerosene lamps. The people in town spoke of Mr. Theodore Darrow in low tones, a man of wealth and land, but colder than the frost that covered his fields. He had once been praised for bringing industry to the outskirts of Neenah, where his mills churned profit, even in the dead of winter. But after his wife's passing, something in him had turned inward and cruel. He ran his home with the same precision he demanded from his machines, every motion calculated, every soul beneath his roof an extension of his control. Among those souls was a young woman named Lydia, barely 20. Her skin carried the tone of mixed heritage that made her stand out in the small Midwestern town, and to the men in power made her easy to ignore, or to own. She had been brought to the estate under the guise of service, but what it really meant was something closer to servitude without consent, a quiet kind of bondage wrapped in the legality of those times and the silence of the people. Lydia no longer remembered the voices of her brothers or the scent of her mother's kitchen. Darrow had seen to that. He had told her in those early days that the past was poison, that if she wished to survive in his world, she must erase them, tear their names from the inside of her mind. It was not enough that she worked for him. He demanded that her very identity be rewritten by his will. Each morning began the same. The sound of the clock striking 5, the smell of coal smoke heavy in the hallways. Lydia would rise, wash in cold water drawn from the pump, and move through the house like a shadow. She would polish the brass knobs, set the firewood, and draw the curtains wide to let winter light fall on marble floors that seemed to belong to another century. The Darrow mansion was an echo chamber of old grief and unspoken things. Paintings of stern ancestors lined the walls, their eyes following her as she moved. In the library, stacked with volumes of law and industry, Theodore Darrow would spend most of his days dictating letters to clients across the state. When Lydia entered to stoke the fire, he would pause mid-sentence, his gaze sharp and unreadable. "You do well to forget the things that don't serve you," he would say without looking up. "Her clean mind makes clean work." Lydia would nod, though every word felt like a blade drawn across the memory of her former self. She had tried at first to hold on to her family, their laughter, the rhythm of their voices, but the constant repetition of his orders, the isolation, the calculated punishment whenever she slipped, it wore her down until the memories began to fade like old photographs left out in the sun. Yet one memory refused to die. A face, her younger sister, Anna, staring through a wagon window as they were separated years before. It would come to her in dreams, a lingering ache that made her wake gasping, gripping the sheets until her hands trembled. On one such morning, while scrubbing the hallway floors, Lydia overheard 2 men Darrow had hired from town. They spoke near the entryway, their voices low. "Man like him don't last long," one said. "Word is he's losing the mill come spring. Too many debts." "The man's a tyrant," muttered the other, striking a match. "If word ever got out about what goes on here—" Lydia stopped, brush frozen mid-stroke. The words hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. Her heartbeat quickened. It was the first crack in Darrow's world she had ever heard. And through that crack, something darker than hope began to stir, a hunger for freedom and for justice. That evening, snow began to fall again, quietly at first, then heavier until the wind howled through the barren fields. Lydia stood by the kitchen window, staring toward the woods that marked the edge of the estate. Somewhere beyond those trees lay the river, and beyond the river the train tracks that led east. She had thought of running before, but fear had always chained her back. Darrow's control was not only physical, it was psychological, stitched deep into her sense of self. He had made her believe escape was impossible, that the world outside would reject her, punish her, or worse. But now, something had changed. The talk of debts, of power slipping from his hands, it was enough to awaken the memory of who she had been before he took everything. Later that night, while serving him supper in the study, she noticed a letter open on his desk. The handwriting wasn't his. She managed a glance, just one, and caught the word auction. Her chest tightened. Perhaps he was preparing to sell the estate. Or perhaps sell her. Her hand trembled as she set down his drink, but he didn't notice. He was too absorbed in his thoughts, his jaw set, his eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness. He was a man used to winning, but something about the way his fingers twitched told Lydia he was cornered. When she left the room, she lingered at the doorway just long enough to hear him mutter to himself, "They think they can take it all from me. I built this. I won't let it crumble." The door creaked as she stepped into the dim hallway. The clock struck 10. The house went silent, except for the soft rasp of the wind outside. Lydia climbed the back stairs to the attic, where her small cot waited, and sat there in the dark. Her hands ached, her mind throbbed from exhaustion, but beneath it all she felt something alive again, an old, dangerous thought. She could destroy him, not through anger, not through violence, but through revelation, through his own secrets. The same control he had used to strip her of herself could be turned against him, if she found the right moment. As the snow piled against the window, she whispered to the shadows, not as a servant, but as someone awakening from a long sleep. "I remember you." "Anna?" Outside, a train whistle cried somewhere far off in the night. Lydia closed her eyes, and for the first time in years she smiled. What she would do next would mark the beginning of Darrow's downfall. Morning came with the creak of wood and the smell of frost burning off the trees. The Darrow estate always woke before the sun, as if its walls themselves refused to rest. Lydia moved through the corridors, her footsteps softened by worn carpets and habit. Every turn of the doorknob, every clink of porcelain had a rhythm she had learned to perform without thought. But inside, a different rhythm had taken hold, a pulse that whispered of change. The master was already in the study when she brought his breakfast. Papers covered his desk like fallen leaves. He didn't look up as she entered. His voice, low and sharp, sliced through the stillness. "Another letter from Green & Co.'s, they threaten again." As if they understand what leverage means. Lydia said nothing. She placed his cup beside the papers, careful not to brush his hand. The steam from the tea fogged her knuckles. For a second, she wanted to lift her gaze, to see the face of the man who had stolen her memory, her name, her years. But she didn't. The moment would come later, she told herself. Not yet. That day, as the air warmed and the snow outside began to soften into mist, Lydia was sent into town with the housekeeper to purchase goods. It was rare that she left the estate, and rarer still that she saw faces untouched by Darrow's commands. The horses pulled the carriage along narrow roads, lined by naked trees and a sky that seemed always close to collapsing into grey. Nina was a modest town, a row of wooden storefronts, a church steeple, a coal yard stained with soot. People still whispered when they saw her. Some stared too long, some looked away too quickly. Lydia kept her eyes on the ground. The market noise hummed around her, a language half forgotten but strangely comforting. She caught fragments of ordinary laughter, the sound of coins clinking, the smell of bread fresh from brick ovens. It was the music of a world she barely remembered. Inside the general store, the housekeeper haggled for flour and oil, while Lydia stacked tins on the counter. Behind her, two men argued near a window. Their words came in pieces. "Darrow will lose that house, mark me. Bank's ready to seize it. He deserves worse," the other spat. "That man thinks himself untouchable." Lydia froze, every nerve awake. There it was again, the crack widening. She turned, pretending to study a shelf of soap, and listened. "Still, he's not stupid," one said. "He's hiding something. A ledger, maybe. He always keeps records, a ledger." The word stuck in her mind like a nail driven deep. Records meant power. Proof meant ruin. If Darrow's dealings were as dark as she suspected, those papers could be his undoing. When they returned to the estate, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and snowmelt. The sky hung heavy, the color of iron. Lydia unloaded the goods and went straight to the pantry, her thoughts turning over like wheels in her head. A ledger. Where could he keep it? That night, after the lamps were dimmed and the staff retired, Lydia lingered in the hallway outside the study. She could hear the faint rasp of his pen and the quiet click of his glass against the wood. Through the keyhole, a sliver of light painted the floor. He was writing again, his hand steady, his eyes intent. Papers stacked to his left, and just beyond them, a thick leather-bound book, its cover cracked, its spine faded from years of handling. The ledger. Her heart pounded so loud she feared he might hear it through the door. She stepped back, breath shallow. The risk was immense. If he found her near that room after hours, punishment would be certain and brutal. But she also knew she could not wait forever. The walls themselves seemed to whisper the same thing she felt in her chest. It's time. That whisper followed her even as she climbed to her attic cot later that night. The house sighed around her, timber shifting, snow sliding off the roof. But beneath it all another sound stirred, the wind rushing through the chimney, carrying faint, almost human tones. She lay awake listening, wondering if the house itself knew what she was about to do. The next morning, as dawn broke, Lydia set her plan. Darrow would ride into town before noon. He always met with the mill foreman on Fridays. That would give her 1 hour, perhaps 2. Enough time to find what she needed. When the moment came, it arrived quietly. The horses clattered down the path, his carriage fading into a blur of grey and frost. Lydia waited until the echo vanished, then slipped down the back staircase, her bare feet silent on cold wood. The air in the study was stale, heavy with cigar smoke and old rage. Papers lay scattered across the desk, but the ledger was gone, her stomach twisted. She opened drawers, shifted books, lifted ledgers bound in red and blue, but none matched the one she had seen. Then she noticed the clock on the mantel. A heavy brass piece carved in the shape of 2 lions. It sat slightly askew, leaving beneath it a patch of wood darker than the rest. She pressed her fingers there and felt it. An edge, a seam in the floor barely visible, a hidden compartment. Her pulse thundered. She knelt and pried it open, revealing a hollow space under the desk. Inside lay the book. She lifted it, brushing off dust, and opened to the first page. Rows of transactions ran down the paper. Dates, signatures, numbers written in his crisp, impatient hand. At first it was only bookkeeping, shipments, wages, material costs. But deeper in, the words shifted. Names appeared beside sums of money she didn't understand. And then, halfway through, sentences jumped off the page. Entries marked with initials and cryptic notes that spoke of bribes, intimidation, and the quiet purchase of lives. Her breath caught. There it was, proof. Proof that Theodore Darrow had not only enslaved her through deception, but trapped others under contracts signed through coercion, false debts, and violence. He had built his fortune on stolen hands and silenced mouths. A sound came from the hallway. Lydia froze. The steady rhythm of boots on hardwood. Her blood rushed cold. He had returned early. She shoved the ledger back into its place, forced the compartment shut, and crossed to the far end of the room. There was only one exit, the servant's stair behind the curtain. But as she reached for it, the door opened. Darrow stood in the threshold. His face was shadowed by the afternoon light, his eyes half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "What are you doing here?" His voice was calm, too calm. Lydia lowered her head. "I came to dust, sir." The fire was out. He stepped forward, setting down his gloves. "The fire," he repeated, then looked at the ashes. The hearth was clean, better tended than usual. His gaze lingered on her longer than it should have. "You've been diligent lately." "I try to serve well," she said quietly. He smiled then, but it wasn't kind. "I expect nothing less." As he turned back toward his desk, Lydia slipped through the curtain, her heart hammering like a trapped bird against her ribs. The moment she reached the narrow stairs, she pressed her back against the wall, gasping silently. He hadn't noticed. At least not yet. From above, the muffled creak of the study floorboards told her he was moving. Then came a faint scrape, the sound of the clock being lifted. Her breath stopped. He knew. The next few minutes stretched into eternity. When silence finally returned, she climbed the stairs, every muscle trembling. That night she didn't sleep at all. She kept hearing the whispering sound again, woven through the wind, the voice of the house warning her, "He's watching." The walls had begun to speak. And now, Lydia knew, she had to act before they silenced her once more. That night, the air inside Lydia's attic room felt heavier than the storm outside. The Darrow estate moaned under the weight of snow, its beams cracking like old bones in the cold. Lydia sat by the tiny window, knees drawn to her chest, teeth clenched against the tremors that rolled through her. She had gone too far to turn back. Darrow knew someone had touched his secrets. The question was, how much had he seen? She remembered the way his jaw had tightened, the brief pause as he'd stared at the clock. He wasn't a man who doubted easily. Suspicion was as natural to him as breath, and yet he had said nothing. Not that day. That made her more afraid than if he had shouted. Silence from a man like Darrow was a gathering storm. As the hours passed, Lydia listened to the house breathe. The pipes groaned, floorboards expanded, and beyond the walls the wind screamed down the valley like some wounded animal. She could almost hear voices within it, hushed, overlapping murmurs. Maybe from memory, maybe from madness. "He knows," they seemed to say. "He knows." She rose quietly before dawn. Her plan was clear now, sharpened by fear and resolve. If Darrow suspected her, then every second she stayed under his roof was borrowed time. But escape without proof was worthless. She needed the ledger, copies, enough to expose him. And to do that, she would have to get close enough to touch it again. The household stirred early. Cook banged pots downstairs, cursing the draught that slipped through the windows. The stable hands cursed the frozen hinges on the carriage doors. Lydia descended the back stairs as if nothing had changed, prepared the morning wood fire, and set the dining table under the dull gold light of gas lamps. Darrow appeared late, unshaven, wearing the same coat from the day before. He didn't greet her. He didn't look at anyone, just poured coffee, stared into it and muttered under his breath. His mood infected the others. Conversation died mid-sentence whenever he entered the room. The housekeeper shot Lydia occasional glances, as if sensing the tension that lay beneath the quiet routine. After breakfast, Darrow ordered her to the library to clean again, a task he rarely assigned twice in 2 days. The moment his words fell, Lydia's stomach twisted. He was testing her. Inside the library, the air smelled of ash and cold smoke. The fire from the night before had gone out completely. The heavy curtains trapped what little daylight there was. Every creak of the floorboards echoed unnaturally loud. She forced herself to work, dusting shelves, straightening books, but her eyes kept drifting to the desk. The clock sat slightly to the left of where she had found it. She needed knowledge, not panic. So while pretending to shake out a rug, she scanned the room for possible hiding spots, vents, drawers, hollow spaces behind paintings. She also noticed something new, a sealed envelope resting on top of the desk, stamped with the seal of Peterson and Harlow Bank. He hadn't opened it yet. Beside it lay the ledger, shifted half an inch closer to the center as if baiting her. She didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, she picked up a scrap of paper from the side table and let her eyes trace the looped handwriting. It wasn't Darrow's. It was from a man named Benton who ran the mill. The note spoke briefly of arrests, of debts unpaid, and of documents to be removed before inspection. It confirmed what Lydia had begun to suspect. The authorities were closing in. The ledger wasn't just a record of corruption. It was the one object binding his empire together. Destroy it, and Darrow's entire house of deceit would fall. Later, while collecting wood from the cellar, Lydia crossed paths with Thomas, the youngest stable hand. He was lean, with wind-burnt skin and hands always smelling of oil and hay. He had joined the estate only weeks before, and unlike the others, he wasn't afraid to meet her eyes. "You're trembling," he said quietly when he saw her. "It's freezing down here, but that's not it, is it?" She hesitated before answering. "I touched something I shouldn't have." He frowned. "Something of his?" She lowered her voice. "Something that could end him." A long silence stretched between them. The sound of dripping water echoed through the cellar. Thomas looked at her, uncertainty pulling at his features. "You don't know me," he said, "but if what you say is true, I'll help you. That man's a wolf. Everyone in town knows what he's done." Lydia looked at him then, searching for deceit, but found none. His eyes carried the same kind of weariness she saw in her own reflection, someone born into silence and fighting to climb out of it. "If you help me," she said, "there'll be no going back." He nodded. "There's nothing worth going back to." That night, their plan took shape in whispers near the service entrance. Thomas would distract Darrow on Sunday evening during his visit to the stables. Lydia would seize those minutes to retrieve the ledger. She would tear out the most damning pages, hide them beneath the lining of her dress, and hand them to Thomas before midnight. He would pass them to a contact in town, someone who owed him a favor at the post office. By the time Darrow noticed, letters would already be on their way to the sheriff and the Milwaukee Tribune. But no plan ever unfolds as cleanly as it's drawn. Sunday came with a brittle sky, sharp and brilliant after a week of storm. The fields shimmered with crusted snow, the branches heavy and glittering. Inside the mansion, silence reigned again. Darrow spent all morning pacing from study to cellar, muttering about betrayal, firing 2 workers on suspicion alone. Lydia stayed invisible, her expression blank, her pulse wild. At dusk, the sound of hooves echoed from the stables, Darrow's signal inspection. Lydia slipped into the study, pulse steadying now not from fear but precision. The lamps cast golden light across the ledger's cover. It was almost too easy. She opened it, tore the section she needed, and folded it against her chest. Then came a sound, a faint creak behind her. She turned. The silhouette in the doorway wasn't Thomas. It was Darrow. His mouth curved, half amusement, half menace. "I thought so." He stepped inside, and she could see the revolver glinting at his side. "I wondered which of you it would be," he said softly. "The mouse or the boy from the stables? I had money on both." Lydia didn't move, her hand pressed to her chest, feeling the fragile outline of the stolen papers. Darrow came closer. "Do you think the law cares for your kind, Lydia? You think they'd read your story in the newspaper and call you hero? They'd call you thief, traitor. You'd hang like any other criminal." His words hit hard, but not enough to shake her anymore. "I'd rather hang with my name in my mouth," she said, "than live with yours in my head." For a moment he froze. The calm, calculated mask slipped, revealing something raw and violent behind his eyes. Then, before he could speak, footsteps sounded from the hall, quick, steady. Thomas burst in, shovel in hand, breathing hard. "Run!" he shouted. Lydia didn't wait. She darted past Darrow, nearly colliding with the wall as the revolver fired. The bullet buried itself in the frame beside her head, splintering wood and spraying dust. She sprinted through the corridor, heart pounding, the torn papers digging into her ribs. Behind her, Darrow roared her name, his voice echoing off every wall like thunder. Lydia didn't look back. She knew there was no going back. The night broke wide open as Lydia fled the Darrow estate. The front door shuddered under her shove, and the cold slapped her face with brute force. Wind whipped across the yard, scattering the snow into ghostly spirals. Her feet sank deep into drifts as she ran, breath tearing out of her chest in sharp gasps. Behind her, the house blazed with light. Darrow's shouting voice carried over the wind, furious, guttural, unrecognizable. She didn't dare glance back. The papers pressed tight against her chest were all that mattered now, the proof, the weapon. The snow swallowed her sound, but her body burned from the sprint. Each step felt heavier as the woods approached, trees clawing at the sky like blackened fingers. She stumbled once, crashing into the frozen earth. For a moment she couldn't breathe. She pressed herself against the ground, heart hammering in her ears. Far in the distance came the faint jingle of reins, then the crack of a whip. Darrow was in the carriage. He was coming. Thomas had said he'd meet her by the old mill road near the bridge. If he hadn't made it, she was done. The cold cut through her dress, seeping into her skin, but she forced herself upright and pushed deeper into the trees. The world narrowed to the sound of her own ragged breathing. Branches clawed at her arms. Her shoes, soaked through, crunched on hard ice. She followed the frozen creek, its surface glittering pale blue under the moonlight. Each bend looked the same, but she knew the land better than he did. He rarely left his estate. She had walked these woods 100 times, gathering firewood, fetching water. Behind her came the faint groan of wagon wheels, the sound bouncing through the trees. He was close. Lydia's mind burned with fragments of every humiliation, every command spoken over her life. Each one turned now to strength. He wanted her to forget her family, so she would remember them with every breath. He wanted her obedience, so she would run toward freedom even if it killed her. As she crossed the frozen creek, the ice cracked beneath her heel. She froze, afraid to move. The sound echoed like a shot. Then another gunshot followed, the real thing. The bark of a tree exploded inches from her face. She threw herself forward, rolling into the snowbank, just as the bullet whined into the night. "Lydia!" His voice tore through the wind. "You can't run from me." She crawled low, teeth chattering, then broke into another desperate sprint. The forest thinned ahead. The bridge lay beyond that clearing, less than 200 yards. She could almost see the faint outline of the wooden rail. A shape moved near it. A lantern swinging high. "Thomas, here," he yelled, waving her on. "Hurry!" She stumbled once more but forced her body forward. The sound of hooves thundered behind her now, closer with every heartbeat. The light from Darrow's lantern flickered through the trees like a wildfire spreading fast. She reached the road as Thomas grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the bridge. His breath came in sharp clouds. "Did you get it?" he shouted over the wind. She nodded, clutching her chest. "The proof. It's here." He turned, scanning the road. From the darkness behind them, Darrow's carriage burst into view. Horses foaming at the mouth, wheels slipping on the snow. His face was white with rage. "Go!" Thomas yelled. "I'll hold him off." Before Lydia could protest, he swung a lantern high and hurled it into the path. It shattered, flames flaring bright against the churned snow. The horses reared, screaming. The carriage jolted sideways, one wheel snapping against a stone post. Darrow leapt free, revolver in hand. Thomas grabbed the reins of their own wagon, an old supply cart hidden under the bridge, and hauled Lydia inside. The horse bolted forward as Darrow fired again. The first shot whizzed past her head. The second struck the wood beside her hand, splinters slicing her skin. She ducked low, clutching the torn papers tight as Thomas lashed the reins. The bridge trembled under the horse's frantic steps, then gave way to the open field beyond. Behind them, Darrow's screams faded into the storm. For a moment there was nothing but pounding hooves and Lydia's heartbeat, the two sounds blending into one. The wind slashed tears from her eyes, but she didn't care. They were free for now. They rode for nearly an hour, heading north toward Appleton. The snow grew deeper, covering the ruts in the road. The horse slowed, exhausted, its breath clouding thick in the air. Thomas finally pulled the reins near a cluster of birches by the river. They dismounted in silence. Lydia's limbs ached as she stepped into the snow. Her hands shook, not from cold now, but from the enormity of what she'd done. Thomas lifted the lantern from the cart, shielding the flame with his hand. "We'll rest here," he said quietly. "It's safe for a while. He won't follow far tonight." Lydia nodded, collapsing beside the frozen riverbank. Her hair clung to her neck, damp with sweat. The papers were still tucked close to her chest, safe. She pulled them out, checking their edges, her breath trembling. Thomas crouched beside her. "You should burn them after you make copies," he said. "Don't risk him taking them back." She shook her head. "Not yet. These words, this ledger, are everything. I want him to see it ruin him first." The firelight flickered across her face, revealing the calm steadiness in her eyes. The girl who had once moved like a shadow through those cold hallways now sat straight-backed and alive, her fear replaced with something sharper. Purpose. Thomas hesitated, studying her expression. "You've changed," he said. Lydia stared across the frozen river. "No," she said quietly. "I'm remembering." They rested only briefly. Before dawn, they reached the outskirts of town. Steam rose from the chimneys of the earliest risers. Lydia pulled her shawl tight and lowered her head, blending among vendors unloading carts for the morning market. At the post office, Thomas slipped inside first. Minutes later, he returned with a folded envelope, new and sealed, addressed in his careful handwriting. She understood immediately. He had copied the pages during the brief stop. "It goes to the Tribune," he said, "and another to the sheriff. By noon the story will be halfway to Milwaukee." Lydia looked at him, her throat tight. "You risked everything. So did you." Before she could answer, a commotion rose down the street, horses, boots, voices shouting. Darrow's men. They had come quicker than she expected. Thomas grabbed her hand. "We can't stay." They dashed through the narrow alleys, dodging barrels and frozen crates. The papers rustled under her arm as she pressed them to her chest. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder, closer. Lydia turned a corner and stopped dead. The road ahead ended at the river. The water, half frozen, reflected the grey sky like shattered glass. Thomas cursed. "There's no bridge here. We'll have to circle back." But before he could move, a gunshot cracked again, echoing between the brick walls. Snow exploded near their feet. "They've seen us," Lydia said, breathless. Thomas turned, a flash of movement, his arm thrown around her shoulders as another shot rang out. The bullet struck him in the side. He staggered, eyes wide, then fell to one knee. "Go," he gasped. "Don't stop." Lydia caught him before he collapsed fully. her hands pressing against the wound. Blood warmed her icy fingers instantly. His breathing came in sharp, broken pulls. "No," she whispered. "Not like this." "We're almost there," he tried to smile, but couldn't. "You have to finish it. Make it matter." Then his hand went limp in hers. Lydia stayed only a moment, her tears burning as they froze against her skin. Then she rose, wiping the blood from her palms. Behind her, Darrow's men shouted orders in the distance. She ran again, into the trees, across the frozen ground, the river wind howling around her. Somewhere in her chest burned a single consuming thought. He would not silence her, not anymore. Every step she took carried the weight of those who came before her, her sister, her family, Thomas. Each one had been taken or broken by men like Darrow. She had the proof, the truth, and soon she would have justice. As the sky brightened in pale grey light, Lydia disappeared into the northern woods, leaving behind blood-soaked snow, a body, and the beginning of Theodore Darrow's fall. Dawn crept over Wisconsin in a thin veil of mist, pulling color back into the frozen world. The little town of Neenah stirred awake to the clang of church bells and the grind of wagon wheels over ice. Smoke curled from chimneys, blending with the pale light easing over the river. No one yet knew that something was shifting beneath their quiet routines, that justice, long asleep in this town, had begun to stir. Lydia arrived just after sunrise, hidden beneath a borrowed shawl from a woman who had taken pity on her along the road. Her boots were caked in frozen mud, her breath trembling as she stepped into the main square. The folded pages pressed tight against her ribs were soaked from melted snow, their ink smudged but still legible. She could not stop thinking of Thomas, of the blood that stained her hands and the promise she had whispered before leaving him behind. The streets were already busy. Merchants shouted across the square, their voices echoing off brick and stone. A line of men queued outside the mill office, waiting for wages. Lydia slipped among them, just another face in the morning haze. She kept her head down. Every shadow looked like Darrow's men. Every laugh twisted her nerves. At the corner stood the Neenah Post and Telegraph. Inside, the clerk stamped envelopes and clipped papers with sleepy repetition. Lydia stepped forward, heart pounding, and pulled a small, sealed envelope from under her dress, the one Thomas had finished before he died. "This must reach Milwaukee by noon," she said, her voice low but steady. The clerk, a man in his 40s with spectacles fogged from the warmth, nodded absently. "Train leaves in 30 minutes, he murmured. "It'll be there by midday." She slid the money across the counter, every cent she had stolen from Darrow's desk that morning. "Make sure it does." As the letter vanished into the metal box, Lydia's pulse slowed for the first time in days. It was done. The truth would travel faster than Darrow could run. The people who had power to bury him would read his own words written in his own hand. But it wasn't safety yet. It was only the beginning. She left the post and found a small cafe near the church, where frost still clung to the windows. The warmth inside hit her like a wave. She took a corner seat away from the door and watched the town awaken through the glass. Carriages rolled by. Children darted between them. Life, for the first time in years, felt real. A waitress stopped by her table. "You look half frozen, dear." "Coffee?" Lydia nodded. When the mug arrived, steaming and black, she took it carefully between her hands. It felt like holding something alive. Through the cafe window, she noticed men moving with unusual speed across the square. Darrow's men. 2 of them she recognized. They scanned each alley, questioning anyone who met their gaze. Her stomach tightened again. She couldn't stay. Leaving a few coins on the counter, she slipped out the back door and into the lane behind the general store. The wind carried the distant sound of shouting, her name perhaps, or orders barked in frustration. She didn't turn to find out. By late morning, the news began to spread. The newspaper office on Water Street received a telegram from Milwaukee Tribune headquarters, a message asking for immediate confirmation of documents implicating Theodore Darrow in fraud, bribery and unlawful indenture. The report had already been typeset and sent for distribution. Within hours, every major paper in the region would carry it. Inside the cold rooms of the mill, workers muttered to each other, whispers spreading faster than smoke. By noon, those whispers reached the merchants and townsfolk, who gathered by the post office demanding answers. Darrow's name became a hiss of scandal before the sun reached its peak. Lydia watched it unfold from the shadows of the alley near the church, hidden beneath her shawl. Her body trembled as she listened to the voices rising around her. Some cursed Darrow's cruelty. Others couldn't believe it, but all of them were talking, and that was enough. By mid-afternoon, a sheriff's carriage drove up the hill toward the estate. The officials carried papers bearing warrants. Lydia stood at the edge of town and watched as the black dots of their silhouettes disappeared into the distance. Snow began to fall lightly, soft as ash. The world felt slow, almost peaceful. She thought of Thomas again, his voice that last moment at the river. Make it matter. She prayed he could see now that it did. The ledger had spoken, and the walls that once confined her would soon crumble with it. As the hours passed, tension rippled through the streets. Whispers turned to rumors to shouts. By the time dusk arrived, horsemen galloped down from the Darrow estate with news. The master of the house had been taken away in shackles. The tavern erupted with noise. Men who had once bowed to him now jeered his name. Women spoke in angry relief, recounting what they had always suspected. The air itself seemed to lift. Lydia stood at the bridge at the edge of town, watching the lights flicker in the windows below. For the first time in years, the weight pressing against her chest began to ease. The snow had finally stopped. The river had thawed just enough to show its reflection. Her face, older somehow, lined not by age but by survival. A group of children ran past her, laughing, chasing each other across the slush. The sound made her smile faintly. Life went on. It always did. She reached into her bag and pulled out the remaining fragments of the ledger, the ones she hadn't sent away. She tore them one by one and let the pieces fall into the river. The ink bled into the water until it disappeared completely. Goodbye, she whispered. Behind her, the sound of church bells began to ring. That night, the headline reached every town between Appleton and Milwaukee. Theodore Darrow arrested. Local magnate accused of slavery, extortion and fraud in thousands of hands. His name turned to disgrace. In every home that read it aloud, Lydia's silence broke. But she did not stay to watch the victory unfold. Before the next morning she was gone, walking east along the railway, her figure small against the pale horizon. The wind brushed her face, gentler now, as if the world had finally decided to spare her. Each step carried her away from the past, and toward the life her master swore she would never reclaim. 489 miles to Chicago, 10,000 whispers of freedom. She did not look back. She no longer needed to. The world looks different when you are no longer hunted. For Lydia, the quiet that followed felt unnatural at first, as if her body still expected the crack of a gun or the scrape of boots behind her. But as the train rolled across the plains toward Chicago, she began to hear new sounds, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels, the murmurs of strangers, the faint whistle of air rushing past frozen fields. Each sound reminded her that she was finally free. She sat by the window, wrapped in a gray shawl, staring at the blur of white outside. Every few minutes she touched the small pendant that hung around her neck, a locket she had found in a drawer at the Darrow estate, its inside empty. She wore it not for memory, but for meaning. The absence inside it was her past. What she filled it with next would be her own choosing. The conductor passed through, checking tickets. When he reached her row, he gave a polite nod. First time to the city? She hesitated, then smiled faintly. First time anywhere. He tipped his hat and moved on, leaving her alone with the hum of motion. At noon, the train halted for coal at a small station near Fond du Lac. Lydia stepped outside to stretch her legs. Steam hissed around the platform, curling through the snow like ghosts. People came and went, merchants, travelers, families bundled in wool. One woman watched her with curiosity, noting her tattered boots and raw hands. Lydia met her gaze steadily until the woman looked away. Whatever stories others imagined, they no longer held power over her. As the whistle blew, Lydia climbed back aboard and found herself seated across from a man reading the Milwaukee Tribune. The headline she already knew stretched across the front page: Darrow trial set. Evidence confirms fraud and abuse. The rest of the story detailed everything: the hidden contracts, the deaths at the mill, the testimony of workers who had come forward since the arrest. Lydia pretended not to notice at first, but her eyes traced the lines. Her own words, written anonymously under the alias A Servant of Truth, appeared halfway down the page. Thomas would have smiled to see it. It was justice in print, permanent and real. She felt no triumph reading it, only a quiet clarity, the kind that comes when a storm finally breaks. 2 days later, she stood in Chicago beneath gray skies and the noise of 1,000 voices. Smoke lifted from factory chimneys, carriages clattered down cobblestone streets, and the air carried the smell of coal and steam. The city was alive in a way she had never known, overwhelming, vast, strangely kind. For the first time, she could choose where to go. She found a room above a tailor's shop on Madison Street. The woman who owned it, a widow named Mrs. Keating, took her in without many questions. "Board's cheap if you can work a needle," she said. Lydia nodded, grateful to have work that required skill instead of silence. Days became weeks. She rose early, stitching until her fingers ached, but her mind stayed restless. At night, she read old newspapers and watched the city lights stretch across the lake. Sometimes she imagined the house on the hill buried in snow, its windows dark, Darrow pacing his cell, walls closing in like the ones he had built around others. The thought brought no joy, only peace. One evening, Mrs. Keating handed her a letter. "Came for you this morning," she said. Lydia frowned. The envelope bore no name, only her address written in careful script. Inside was a note, unsigned. "They say he will speak at the trial tomorrow. The town expects a confession, but a man like him will not go quietly. If you attend, be prepared to see what guilt does to the proud." The words made her stomach tighten. She hadn't intended to return, but something in the message compelled her to stand there, to see him one last time, to end it properly. She decided before she could talk herself out of it. The next morning, she boarded the first train back north. The courthouse in Appleton stood tall and white against the winter sky. A crowd gathered outside, bundled in wool coats, breath fogging in the cold. Lydia joined them quietly, her shawl pulled low. Inside, the courtroom smelled of oak and paper and anticipation. Theodore Darrow looked smaller than she remembered. Not defeated, just stripped of the illusions that once made him monumental. His hair had gone grey around the edges, his hands trembled faintly on the table. When the judge called his name, his eyes flicked across the room and froze on hers. Recognition burned there, shock first, then anger, and beneath it all fear. The prosecutor spoke for nearly an hour, presenting ledgers and letters, testimony and sworn statements. Lydia watched silent as the pieces of Darrow's life, his empire, his control, were laid out and dismantled in front of strangers. Every figure, every name, every deceit, catalogued like evidence of a sickness. At last the judge allowed Darrow to address the court. He rose slowly, gripping the rail, voice low but steady. "I built something," he said. "I gave this town work, homes, lives, and now I am condemned by the same people who prospered beneath me. Do you think they didn't know how I ran things? Do you think she—" He paused, eyes locking on Lydia again. "Was innocent in her gain?" Murmurs spread through the room. Lydia stayed still. She saw it clearly now, the man trying to twist his ruin into justification. His words could no longer reach her. When the judge silenced him, Darrow's shoulders slumped. The sentencing came swiftly. Years in prison for fraud, restitution of every cent stolen. But the law could never account for the harm that lived in memory. Justice was imperfect, but enough. As the guards led him away, Darrow glanced back once more, his expression unreadable. Lydia met his stare but said nothing. The silence between them spoke louder than any curse. Outside, snow drifted softly. The crowd began to disperse in murmurs of satisfaction and disbelief. Lydia stood by the courthouse steps, watching her breath fog against the morning light. For so long she had imagined this moment and what it would feel like. And yet, freedom was quieter than she had expected. That night she returned to Chicago by train, the motion rocking her into a light sleep. Her dreams no longer carried his voice. Spring came early that year. The city thawed, streets filled with rain, and by April hawkers shouted their wares again under banners of color. Lydia had saved enough to open a small place of her own, a dress shop near the river. Women came daily for fittings, drawn by the fine work and the quiet grace of the seamstress who never raised her voice. None of them knew her story, and she did not offer it. She didn't need to. The past had already burned itself into history books and courthouse records. What mattered now was the life she built with her own 2 hands. Sometimes when wind from the lakeshore carried the faintest chill, she would close her eyes and remember. The creak of the Darrow Estate's staircase, the firelight against old wood, the voice that once commanded her to forget, and then she would exhale, glance at the fabric in her hands and whisper as if to herself, "I remember everything." Outside, the bells of the city chimed across the skyline, and Lydia smiled. At last the reckoning was complete. By the time the trees turned green again, Lydia had become someone the city knew, not by name but by presence. Her shop on the corner of Madison and Wells had grown into a sanctuary for working women, nurses, seamstresses, widows who needed wedding gowns altered for their daughters. The bell above the door rang from dawn until dusk, and the hum of conversation filled the air like music. She moved through it all quietly, her hands always at work. The rhythm of cutting and stitching had a strange peace to it. Each thread drawn through cloth felt like closing a wound. It wasn't the life she once imagined for herself, but one she had built alone, without permission, without chains. Sometimes customers asked about her accent. It had softened but not vanished. "Where are you from?" They'd say kindly. She'd smile a little and answer, "Somewhere very far away," and that was always enough. On a Sunday in June, as the heat shimmered across the rooftops, a letter arrived bearing a Milwaukee postmark. Lydia hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single sheet written in neat script. "Theodore Darrow has taken ill. The sheriff believes he will not live long. He asks to see you." She stared at the words for a long while, her fingers twitching as if to tear the paper apart. But the years had tempered her anger into something quieter, curiosity mixed with unease. There were no debts left between them, she told herself. Yet the thought of looking into his eyes again, the man who tried to erase her entire world, felt like closing a circle she had left open too long. 3 days later, she boarded a train west. The prison stood on the outskirts of Waupun, grey stone and iron framed against open sky. The guard at the gate looked surprised at her arrival. "He's not received visitors in years," he said, leading her through the echo of corridors. "Doesn't speak much now. Won't eat, just waits." When they opened the cell door, the sight that greeted her was not the man she remembered. Darrow sat hunched on a wooden bench, his body thinned by confinement, his hair white, eyes hollow but still sharp beneath the shadows. A cough racked his chest when he tried to speak. Lydia. Her name scraped from his throat like gravel. She did not flinch. "Mr. Darrow." He studied her in silence a long moment. Then he smiled faintly, almost regretfully. "You're older now, stronger. I thought you'd left this world behind." "I have," she said. "But you called me back." His fingers twitched and he coughed again, fighting for breath. "I needed to see what became of you, to know whether I succeeded or failed." Her voice was calm. "You failed." Something flickered behind his eyes. Shame, pain, something unnameable. "They took everything," he murmured. "The house, the mill, the land. But they couldn't take the memory. Every night I saw that door open, you standing there with fire in your eyes. I hated you for it. And then in time I envied you for it." "Envy?" she asked quietly. He nodded, gaze unfocused. "Because you left me behind. You carried something I never had, the chance to change." The silence between them stretched. The guard at the door shifted uneasily but said nothing. "Why did you really want me here?" she asked finally. After a long pause, he whispered, "To ask forgiveness." The words hung in the air like smoke. Lydia's throat tightened, but not from pity. There was no absolution she could offer, not for what he had done to her or to the others. But still she stepped closer, until only the bars separated them. "I don't forgive you," she said softly, "but I release you." His eyes filled with tears that glistened in the dim light. "That's more mercy than I deserve." "It's not mercy," she said. "It's freedom for me." When she turned to leave, he called her name again, weaker this time. "What will you do now?" She looked back at him, the corners of her mouth lifting. "Live under a new name." Outside, the sunlight struck her face as she left the prison grounds. The air smelled of lilac and iron, of rain waiting in the distance. For the first time since she could remember, her steps felt light. That night, back in Chicago, she took a small box from her dresser, the locket she had carried since the winter she fled. Inside, she placed a folded slip of paper with 2 words written carefully in ink, Anna's name and her own. She closed it gently and hung it back around her neck. The next morning, A new sign appeared above her shop door. The Anna Lydia Sewing House, clothes made with honor. For the women who walked through that door, it became more than a tailoring business. It was a place where they were treated kindly, where hands scarred by labor learned craft and dignity. She taught them what she had learned through pain, that rebuilding meant not forgetting, but remembering differently. Word spread through the city. Orders came from Milwaukee, St. Paul, even as far as Detroit, but Lydia never changed her routine. At dusk, she would lock the door, leave a single candle burning in the window, and walk the same route home through the narrow streets. Neighbors often saw her pausing at the river, staring at the water, perhaps listening to something unseen. No one asked her what she heard. Sometimes, on rain-heavy nights, she swore she could almost hear Thomas's laughter carried by the wind, or the faint whistle of a long train heading east. And when she smiled, it was the quiet smile of a woman who had outlived her pain, carrying it not as weight but as memory, a thread woven into something lasting. The city lights reflected across the dark water, and Lydia whispered the words that had kept her alive since the beginning. "It's my name now, and I will never forget it." Years slipped quietly through the city's veins, soft as thread pulling through fabric. The Anna Lydia Sewing House became a cornerstone of its neighborhood, a place of laughter, labor, and quiet pride. The shop windows glimmered every evening with the glow of kerosene lamps, and the rhythmic hum of sewing machines filled the streets long after sunset. Lydia had grown older, though the light in her eyes never dimmed. Her hair, streaked with silver, framed a face both stern and tender, the kind that drew respect without asking for it. The women who worked beside her called her Miss Anna, a name that carried no history of pain, only the dignity born from it. But every stitch she made held the echo of the life she had endured. She never spoke of it to her apprentices, though sometimes they caught her staring into the distance, her hands motionless over the fabric, as if remembering a pattern that existed only in memory. One evening, as dusk poured over the city, Lydia sat by the window finishing a wedding veil. The lace was thin as frost, delicate as breath. It reminded her of her mother's stories, of the way she used to hum while working beside the fire. Moments like these, the sound of thread sliding through cloth, the heartbeat rhythm of the needle, were her peace. A knock sounded at the door. She looked up to find a young woman standing there, hesitant but smiling shyly. "Are you the owner?" the girl asked. Lydia nodded. "Come in, dear. What do you need?" The girl stepped inside, clutching a folded newspaper. She set it gently on the counter. The name printed across the page caught Lydia's eye. It was her own, though she hadn't used it in years. Milwaukee Tribune, the Lydia Darrow case. 20 years later. Lydia's hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. The story recounted her testimony, redacted for safety, and the ultimate fate of Theodore Darrow, who had died in his cell a decade earlier. But what caught her breath was the second half of the article. It spoke of the women who had followed her example across Wisconsin and Illinois, small cooperatives and workshops founded in her honor. The Anna Lydia Sewing House, it read, had become the foundation for the Women's Guild of Trades and Needlework, the first organization in the region devoted to employing and educating impoverished women. The young visitor noticed her silence. "My mother started one of those guilds," she said. "She wanted me to find you. She said without you, none of us would have had a chance." Lydia looked at her, heart swelling with quiet disbelief. "What is your name?" "Sarah Benton," the girl said. "My family worked in the mills once." Benton. The name pulled something deep within her. Thomas's contact, Mr. Benton, the man whose note she had read so long ago. Perhaps this girl was his daughter, another life shaped by that turning point. Lydia set the paper down and smiled faintly. "Your mother did the hard work, child. I only opened a door." The girl shook her head. "You showed her it could be done." "That's more than most ever did." After the girl left, Lydia lingered by the window long after dark. The lamps flickered in the workshop behind her. She could hear her apprentices laughing softly, finishing their tasks before heading home. Outside, the city lights stretched endless, the sky clear and kind. It struck her how far she had come, from the cold silence of a house on a Wisconsin hill to this small refuge humming with life and purpose. Every scar, every loss, every step had led here. Later that night, She sat at her work table, took out a fresh sheet of parchment, and began to write. Not a letter, but a record, a memory. She wrote of the winter of 1902, of the house and the master who demanded she forget. She wrote of the day she ran, the fire in her lungs, the weight of the ledger pressed to her chest. She described Thomas, brave and kind, and the world they had changed together, even if only for a moment. Her handwriting was imperfect now, her hands unsteady, but the lines came easily. When she finished, she folded the pages and sealed them in an envelope marked, "To be opened when I'm gone." Then she placed it inside the same locket box on her dresser and lay down to rest. Weeks turned into months. The shop continued without pause, and to her apprentices, Lydia became less a person than a story, a woman who had survived something no one could name yet inspired everyone to stand taller. When winter came again, she fell ill. Pneumonia crept in quietly, leaving her too weak to rise from bed. The women she had taught took turns caring for her, bringing tea, reading small articles from the paper, telling her how the guilds were expanding, how women from factories sought training at every new branch. She listened with a faint smile. "Good," she would whisper. "Keep building. Don't stop." On her last morning, snow fell outside the shop window. She asked to be moved closer to the light. They set her chair beside the glass, where she could see the children passing in the street, their laughter landing gently on the frozen air. Her breath came shallow and slow. She reached out for the nearest spool of thread and held it between her fingers. "This," she said softly, "holds everything together. Remember that." A few hours later, the light in her room dimmed and she was gone. Peacefully, quietly, like the sound of a final knot being tied. When they found the letter days later and opened it, the women gathered to read every word. Some cried. Others smiled. And when they finished, they wrapped her locket around the handle of the old sewing machine that had started it all. They renamed the shop once more, carving the words onto a brass plate by the door. "The Lydia Foundation. Strength is something we make." Years after, travelers in Chicago would pass the corner on Madison Street and hear the steady rhythm of sewing machines inside. They'd see women laughing through the windows, their hands moving in unison, thread glinting in the light. And somewhere in that quiet persistence, in the workmanship, the faith, the memory, Lydia lived on, not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as a creator. The legacy of her hands would never unravel. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.